What if the air outside your home was forbidden, not dangerous, not restricted by curfew or weather? Forbidden. What if crossing your own threshold without a male relative's permission could end your marriage, strip you of your children, and erase your legal right to food and shelter? This was not metaphor. This was not spiritual teaching. This was law. 1st century Judea, Roman-occupied Palestine, agricultural villages scattered across Galilee and the hill country surrounding Jerusalem. For the women living in those limestone houses, the world outside their door might as well have been another planet. They could see it. They could hear the voices of men conducting business in the street. But stepping into that space alone was a transgression that could destroy their lives. A woman seen in public without her head covered could be divorced without ketubah compensation. The ketubah was the marriage contract guaranteeing financial support if the marriage ended. Without it, she had nothing. No home, no children, no legal standing, no survival. The covering wasn't about modesty. It was about ownership, and the law was clear. A woman who removed it in public had forfeited her right to protection. The houses they lived in still exist. Archaeologists have excavated dozens of first-century homes in Nazareth, Capernaum, and Magdala. Single-room structures carved from limestone, 300 to 400 square feet total, one door, no windows facing the street. The architecture was intentional. Privacy wasn't a courtesy, it was enforcement. These homes sheltered entire families, parents, children, grandparents, and animals. Goats and chickens lived inside because the streets were too valuable as male space to waste on livestock pens. The air inside was thick with smoke from cooking fires that burned olive wood and dried dung. There was no chimney. The smoke rose through gaps in the roof. In winter, it was the only heat. In summer, it was suffocating. This was the world: 4 walls, packed earth floors, a grinding stone, a loom, a storage jar for grain, a water jug, and the door. All was controlled by men. The legal framework was absolute. In first-century Jewish law, women existed in a state of permanent legal minority. They could not own property. They could not initiate divorce. They could not testify in court. They could not make binding contracts. They were not autonomous persons under the law. They were possessions, transferred from father to husband at marriage. The transaction was recorded, witnessed, legally binding. The language used in marriage contracts was the same language used for property transfers. A daughter was given. A wife was acquired. The father held authority called reshut, meaning domain or control. At marriage, that authority transferred to the husband. The woman herself had no say in the transfer. Girls were typically married between the ages of 12 and 13. The men were often 30 or older. This was not unusual. This was standard practice. Papyrus contracts recovered from the Judean desert confirm it. Child marriage wasn't a fringe behavior. It was structural. Modern archaeology has shattered the romanticized version of biblical life that persisted for centuries. The discovery of the Magdala Synagogue in 2010 revealed something scholars had suspected but couldn't prove. Women were completely separated from public religious life. The synagogue had a stone partition. On one side, men prayed, read scripture, and participated in communal worship. On the other side, women sat in silence. They could not read from the Torah. They could not lead prayer. They could not teach. The stone that divided the space is still there. You can see it. Smooth limestone carved with temple imagery. A physical barrier that said, "This far and no farther." Religious authority was male authority. The synagogue wasn't a place of shared worship. It was a place where the legal separation of women from public religious participation was architecturally enforced. The system didn't operate through occasional restrictions. It operated through total control of movement, time, labor, and body. A woman's day was not her own. Her body was not her own. Her children were not her own. Even her voice was regulated. The Mishnah, the written compilation of oral Jewish law, completed around 200 Common Era, records that a woman who speaks too loudly in her own home can be divorced. The standard was set by male religious authorities. If her voice can be heard in the neighboring house, it is too loud. The implication was clear. A woman's presence was supposed to be invisible. Her voice was supposed to be inaudible. She was supposed to occupy space without claiming it. This was the world that women like Mary of Nazareth, Joanna, wife of Chuza, and Susanna inhabited. Not the softly lit nativity scenes, not the reverent paintings of women at the well looking peacefully into the distance. The actual world was smoke and stone and silence. It was grinding grain in darkness before dawn. It was carrying water jars that weighed 40 pounds when full. It was weaving cloth until your fingers bled. It was bearing children at 13 and watching half of them die before age 5. It was knowing that your husband could take a second wife and there was nothing you could say. It was living your entire life inside a space smaller than a modern studio apartment and being told that this confinement was divine design, that it was for your protection, that it was the natural order of creation, that God Himself had commanded it. But here's what the archaeological record also reveals. This system was not inevitable. It was not universal. It was a choice. Egyptian women in the same time period owned businesses. They initiated divorce. They testified in court. They bought and sold property in their own names. Roman women had legal guardians, but those guardians were often formalities. Wealthy Roman women controlled fortunes. They funded political campaigns. They appeared in public. Greek women were more restricted, but even they had more autonomy than their Jewish counterparts. The Babylonian legal tradition, codified 1,000 years earlier under Hammurabi, gave women rights to inherit, to divorce under specific conditions, to protect their dowries. The Jewish legal system in first-century Palestine was the most restrictive in the ancient Mediterranean world, not because ancient life required it, but because the men who wrote the law chose it, and the women who lived under that law had no vote. No voice in the rabbinic courts that debated the fine points of how much of her body had to be covered. No representation in the religious councils that determined whether her testimony counted as evidence. They were the subject of the law, never its authors. Their entire existence was narrated by men, described by men, regulated by men, judged by men. And for 2,000 years, that male narration was treated as objective history, as if the men who wrote it had no interest in justifying their own power, as if the system they described was neutral observation rather than active construction. But archaeology doesn't lie. Bones don't have an agenda. Contracts don't rewrite themselves to sound more just. The physical evidence that survives tells a different story than the one religious authorities wanted preserved. And that story begins with the door, the threshold, the line between the interior female world and the exterior male world, a line that women crossed at their own risk. The day began in darkness, pre-dawn, 4:30 in the morning by modern time, though no clocks existed to measure it. The trigger was necessity. Grain had to be ground before bread could be made, and bread had to be ready by mid-morning when the men returned from the fields. The grinding stone was called a rechaim, 2 stones, the lower one stationary and slightly concave, the upper one round and flat with a wooden handle. A woman knelt on the ground and pushed the upper stone in circles, crushing wheat or barley kernels between the 2 surfaces. The motion was repetitive, endless. 2 to 3 hours of grinding to produce enough flour for 1 day's bread. The sound was rhythmic, a low scraping that filled the dark house before anyone else woke. Her knees pressed into the packed earth, her back bent, her shoulders and arms bearing the weight of the stone with every rotation. Skeletal remains from first-century Galilee show severe wear on the vertebrae and shoulder joints of adult women. Repetitive stress damage, the kind that comes from doing the same motion thousands of times. The grinding stone didn't just make flour, it made the body of the woman using it into evidence. After grinding came water. The well was the only public space women were allowed to access regularly, but even that access was regulated. There were specific hours: early morning, late afternoon, times when the streets were less crowded and male traffic was minimal. A woman went to the well with a clay jar balanced on her head or shoulder. The jar, when full, weighed between 30 and 40 pounds. She carried it back to her house without complaint, because complaint was pointless. There was no alternative, no plumbing, no storage tanks. Every drop of water used for cooking, cleaning, and drinking had to be carried by hand. If she went to the well at the wrong time, or lingered too long talking to other women, or allowed her headscarf to slip, she risked public shame. Men could rebuke her. Neighbors could report her to her husband or father. The well wasn't a social space. It was a monitored checkpoint. Bread making consumed the next 4 to 6 hours. First-century Palestinian bread wasn't leavened with yeast in the way modern bread is. It was flatbread. Dough made from the flour she'd just ground, mixed with water and a small amount of olive oil if the family could afford it. She kneaded it on a flat stone, shaped it into rounds, then baked it on a clay dome called a tabun, an outdoor oven heated with burning wood or dried animal dung. The tabun had to be preheated. The fire had to be maintained at the right temperature. Too hot, and the bread burned. Too cool, and it stayed raw. She baked enough for the entire family for the day. Bread was the staple. For most families, it was 70% of the diet. Everything else, when available, was supplemental. Lentils, onions, dried fish, olives, cheese if they kept goats. But bread was survival, and making it was her responsibility. If the bread was poor quality, it was her failure. If there wasn't enough, it was her failure. The men didn't bake. They didn't grind. They didn't carry water. That labor was invisible to the outside world because it happened inside the house. But it was the foundation of everything else. Between bread making and sunset came textile work, spinning, weaving, mending. Every piece of clothing the family wore had to be made by hand. Wool came from sheep that had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, and spun into thread using a drop spindle, a small weighted stick that twisted fibers into usable thread as it hung and rotated in the air. The motion required constant attention. If the spindle dropped, the thread tangled. Hours of work could be lost. Once the thread was ready, it went on to a loom, a vertical frame made of wood with stone weights hanging from the warp threads to keep them taut. She stood at the loom and passed the weft thread through, row by row, creating fabric one line at a time. A single tunic took weeks to make, a cloak took months, and clothing wore out, tore, needed constant repair. This work destroyed eyesight. Ancient skeletal evidence shows high rates of vision degradation in adult women. The close focus, the dim light, the endless hours staring at thread. By age 30, many women could barely see. Child rearing happened simultaneously with all of this. Infants were nursed for 2 to 3 years. Toddlers had to be kept away from the grinding stone, the fire, the loom weights. Older children were taught their roles. Girls learned to grind, spin, weave, bake. Boys were taught by their fathers. The separation began early. A 5-year-old girl was already learning that her world was interior, domestic, silent. A 5-year-old boy was already learning that his world was exterior, public, authoritative. The architecture of gender was built into childhood. By the time they reached adolescence, the roles were naturalized. It didn't feel like oppression to many of them. It felt like reality. And all of this, every single task, happened within a 300-square-foot space shared with extended family and animals. There was no privacy, no solitude, no room of her own, no door she could close. The goats slept in the corner, the chickens nested in the rafters, the children ran underfoot. The mother-in-law watched. The husband entered and exited as he pleased. The house was her domain in theory. In practice, it was a cage with a rotating cast of supervisors. The covering system was the visible enforcement of all of this. A woman in first-century Judea wore multiple layers in public. The first was the mitbahat, a headscarf that covered her hair completely. Hair was considered sexually provocative. A woman's uncovered hair in public was treated as a form of nudity. The second layer was the redid, a veil that could be drawn across the face. The third was the tzaif, an outer cloak that covered the body from shoulders to ankles. All three were required. The Mishnah in Tractate Ketubot 7 verse 6 lists going out with an uncovered head as one of the grounds for divorce without ketubah compensation. That meant a woman divorced for this reason received nothing, no financial settlement, no return of her dowry, no support for her children. She was sent back to her father's house if he would take her. If he wouldn't, she had no legal recourse. She became dependent on charity or worse. The veil wasn't modesty. It was the terms of a contract. Cover yourself or lose everything. But even covered, even silent, even confined to acceptable hours and spaces, women were still seen as threats. The rabbis debated endlessly about women's capacity to cause sin by existing in public. One teaching recorded in the Mishnah warns that a man should not walk behind a woman on the road, even his own wife, because the sight of her from behind might provoke lustful thoughts. The solution wasn't to discipline male behavior, it was to remove women from visibility. Another teaching states that a man should not speak with a woman in the street, even to give directions, because prolonged conversation with a woman leads to immorality. The responsibility for male sin was placed on female presence. If a man sinned, the question asked was, why was she there? The legal texts reveal the depth of control. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, wrote in Against Apion that the woman is in all things inferior to the man, not different, inferior. The language mattered. It wasn't a description of roles, it was a hierarchy. The Mishnah Tractate Sota describes the ritual for a woman suspected of adultery. If a husband believed his wife had been unfaithful, he could bring her to the temple and force her to drink bitter water, a mixture that included dust from the temple floor and ink dissolved from a written curse. The ritual was designed to humiliate her publicly and, according to the text, cause physical harm if she was guilty. Her guilt didn't have to be proven. His suspicion was enough. She had no right to refuse, no right to defend herself. The ritual assumed that a woman's body was subject to religious and legal punishment, based solely on male accusation. And this wasn't fringe practice. It was codified law, taught, enforced, accepted. The architecture of the houses reinforced all of it. No windows facing the street. The reason was explicit: to prevent women from being seen by men outside the family, to prevent them from seeing the outside world. Archaeological excavations at Sepphoris, a major city in Galilee, revealed homes with separate women's quarters, interior rooms with no direct access to the street. A woman living in one of those rooms could spend her entire life without seeing the world beyond her courtyard. And skeletal analysis from those same excavations shows something haunting: vitamin D deficiency, bone density consistent with inadequate sunlight exposure. These women lived in darkness, literal, physical darkness. The sun rose and set outside their walls, and they saw it only in fragments, through doorways, through the gap in the roof where the smoke escaped. They were buried in shadow while still alive. If this feels distant, if it feels like ancient history disconnected from the present, consider what it means that this system was defended as God's will, that it was preached as divine order, that women were told their confinement was protection, their silence was virtue, their submission was righteousness, and that many of them believed it, because when you are born into a cage and everyone around you calls it a house, you don't know you're trapped. You think the world is supposed to be that small. Babatha's archive is one of the most important archaeological discoveries for understanding women's lives in first-century Judea. She was real. Her name was Babatha, daughter of Simeon. She lived in a village called Maoza near the Dead Sea, and when she died, hiding in a cave during the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 Common Era, she had her legal documents with her, 35 papyrus scrolls, marriage contracts, property deeds, court petitions, receipts. They were preserved in the dry desert air for nearly 2,000 years. When archaeologists found them in 1961, they found Babatha's voice, not filtered through male scribes writing about women in general. Her specific legal battles, her property, her struggles. And what those documents reveal is a woman with resources who still had almost no freedom. Babatha owned land. She had inherited date palm orchards from her father. She had remarried after her first husband died, and her second husband also owned property. By the standards of her time and place, she was wealthy. But wealth didn't buy autonomy. The documents show that she couldn't travel from Maoza to the provincial capital without a male guardian's written permission. She couldn't make legal contracts without male representation. When her second husband died, his family tried to take control of her son's inheritance. She fought them in court. The petitions survive. She argued. She presented evidence. She demanded her son's rights. But the court required her to have a male guardian present to make her case. Her voice in the legal record is always mediated, always filtered through a man who had to stand beside her and validate her words. Even with money, even with land, even with written law on her side, she couldn't speak for herself. One document in the archive is particularly devastating. It's a receipt for a loan. Babatha had to borrow money and use her son's property as collateral. The reason isn't stated, but the timing suggests it was during a period when her second husband's family was blocking her access to estate funds. She had wealth she couldn't access, and a son she couldn't fully protect because the law didn't recognize her authority over her own child. Boys remained under their mother's care until a certain age, but legal guardianship belonged to male relatives. If those relatives decided to exclude her, she had limited recourse. The courts were run by men. The judges were men. The witnesses had to be men. A woman's testimony wasn't admissible in property disputes. She could fight, but the system wasn't designed for her to win. Babatha died in that cave. Her bones were found with the documents. She was hiding from Roman soldiers who were crushing the Jewish revolt. She didn't make it out, but her papers did, and they tell a story the rabbis didn't want told, that even a woman with every advantage the system allowed was still fundamentally trapped. The ossuaries tell a different kind of story. An ossuary is a stone box used for secondary burial. In 1st century Judea, bodies were placed in tomb caves and left to decompose. After about a year, the bones were collected and placed in an ossuary inscribed with the deceased's name. Thousands of these boxes have been recovered from necropolises around Jerusalem, and the inscriptions on women's ossuaries are evidence of erasure. Women are identified almost exclusively by their relationships to men. Miriam, daughter of Simeon, Salome, wife of Judah, Marta, daughter of Eleazar. Never Miriam the teacher, never Salome the merchant, never Marta who led the community. Their entire identity collapsed into whose daughter, whose wife, whose mother they were. A woman's name was written, but herself was not. Some of those ossuaries contain additional information. In 2006, archaeologists analyzing skeletal remains from 1st century tombs published findings on maternal mortality. 1 in 3 women died from childbirth or pregnancy-related complications. The bones don't lie. Pelvic fractures that didn't heal, infections that spread through the body, hemorrhaging that couldn't be stopped. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no surgical intervention. A complicated birth was a death sentence, and women were married at 12 or 13, which meant they were giving birth before their bodies were fully developed. The skeletal evidence shows girls as young as 14 dying with infant bones still in the birth canal. The ossuary inscriptions are brief. Miriam, daughter of Simeon, who died in childbirth aged 16. No other details, just the fact of her death. The fact of her age. The fact that her life ended trying to produce the next generation. One ossuary stays with you. It was found in a tomb outside Jerusalem. The inscription reads, Salome, daughter of someone whose name is unreadable, who died bearing twins. Both infants died. The bones in the box confirm it. 3 skeletons, 1 adult female, 2 newborns. The twins were full term. She carried them to completion. And then all 3 of them died. The inscription doesn't say how old she was. It doesn't say if she had other children. It doesn't say if anyone mourned. Just the fact. She died, they died. The family buried them together and moved on. Contrast this with evidence from Egypt in the same period. The Babatha archive isn't the only papyrus collection from the ancient world. Egyptian papyri from the 1st and 2nd centuries Common Era show women operating in an entirely different legal reality. A woman named Apollonia appears in documents from Oxyrhynchus. She owned a weaving workshop. She employed both men and women. She bought raw materials, sold finished goods, and signed contracts in her own name. When her husband struck her during an argument, she took him to court. The legal petition survives. She described the assault. She demanded compensation. The court ruled in her favor. Her husband was fined. This was possible because Egyptian law recognized women as legal persons. They could testify, they could bring charges, they could own businesses. A woman in Egypt could divorce her husband by declaration. No male permission required. She stated her intent in front of witnesses, and the marriage was dissolved. This matters because it destroys the argument that ancient women were universally oppressed by technological limitations or biological inevitability. Egypt and Judea existed at the same time. They had similar levels of technology, similar agricultural economies, similar patriarchal structures, but Egyptian law made different choices. Those choices gave women different lives, not equal lives, not free lives by modern standards, but lives with more autonomy, more legal standing, more room to move. The contrast proves that the extreme restrictions in 1st century Judea were cultural decisions, not historical inevitabilities. The men who wrote Jewish law could have written it differently. They chose not to. Another case, the ritual of the Sotah, a woman suspected of adultery. The Mishnah devotes an entire tractate to this ritual, which means it was common enough to require detailed legal regulation. The procedure was this. If a husband suspected his wife of infidelity, he brought her to the temple. A priest prepared the bitter water by mixing dust from the temple floor with water and dissolving ink from a written curse into the mixture. The woman was forced to drink it in front of witnesses. The text claims that if she was guilty, her body would suffer visible harm, her belly would swell, her thigh would rupture. If she was innocent, nothing would happen. But here's the critical detail. The husband didn't need proof, he didn't need witnesses, he needed suspicion. His word was enough to subject her to public humiliation and physical danger. And she had no right to refuse, no right to demand he prove his accusation, no right to bring a countercharge. The ritual existed because the law assumed that a woman's sexual fidelity was a matter of public religious concern that justified state intervention in her body. This wasn't theoretical. Archaeologists have found references to the ritual in legal documents and synagogue inscriptions. It happened. Women were forced to drink that mixture, and whether it caused physical harm or not. The psychological and social harm was absolute. A woman subjected to the Sotah ritual was marked. Even if the water did nothing, even if she was declared innocent, everyone knew she had been accused. Everyone knew her husband didn't trust her. In a society where reputation was survival, that accusation was permanent damage. One more piece of evidence. The excavation at Sepphoris, a major city in Galilee. Population around 8,000 in the 1st century. Archaeologists uncovered an entire residential district with homes that had separate women's quarters, interior rooms accessible only through courtyards with no direct access to the street. Some of these rooms had no windows at all, just walls, a doorway, a space to sleep and work, and exist unseen. The skeletal remains recovered from the Sepphoris necropolis show patterns, vitamin D deficiency, as already mentioned, but also dental wear consistent with 4+ hours of daily grain grinding, compression fractures in the spine from carrying heavy loads, and something else. Healed fractures to the ribs, arms, and facial bones, injuries consistent with repeated physical trauma, domestic violence. And there was no legal recourse. A man couldn't be charged with assaulting his wife unless the injuries were severe enough to threaten her life. Bruises didn't count. Broken bones didn't count unless they caused permanent disability. The law considered a man's right to discipline his household more important than a woman's right to safety. One skeleton from Sepphoris haunts the record. Female, age 20 to 25 at death. Multiple healed rib fractures on both sides of the torso. A healed fracture to the left eye socket. Compression damage to 2 vertebrae, and she died in childbirth. The infant's skeleton was still partially in the birth canal. She carried those injuries for years, survived them, kept working, kept bearing the grinding stone and the water jug and the loom weights, and then died bringing another life into the world that had given her nothing but pain. These are not stories. These are bodies. These are receipts. The women who lived these lives didn't know their bones would be dug up 2,000 years later and read as evidence. They didn't know their ossuaries would be cataloged in museums. They didn't know Babatha's legal fights would be studied by scholars. They lived and died believing the system was inevitable, that it was righteous, that it was the will of God. And the men who built that system made sure the next generation believed it too. For 2,000 years, the version of history that survived was written by the people who benefited from that system. Rabbis, church fathers, male scholars, male translators, male editors, and what they preserved was the story they wanted told. But archaeology doesn't have an agenda. Papyrus doesn't rewrite itself. Bones don't lie. And when you dig deep enough, you find the cracks, the contradictions, the evidence that the story you were told was incomplete or wrong. That's what happened when scholars started comparing early Christian texts with later edited versions. That's what happened when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and compared with rabbinic writings from centuries later. The official narrative started falling apart. Here's the revelation that changes everything. Early Jewish and Christian sources contradict the later claims about women's roles. Evidence suggests that 1st century women had more freedom than 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century women. The restrictions didn't stay the same. They increased. The cage got smaller over time, and the people who tightened it rewrote history to make it look like the cage had always been that size. Case 1. The disappearing deaconesses. In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 1, he writes, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a diakonos of the church at Cenchreae. Diakonos. The Greek word used for deacon, the same word Paul uses to describe male church leaders like Timothy and Apollos. Phoebe was a deacon, a leader, someone with authority in the early Christian community. But later Greek manuscripts did something interesting. They changed the word, not to a different word entirely, just to a feminine form, diakonisa. And then translators went further. In English Bibles for centuries, Phoebe wasn't called a deacon, she was called a servant or a helper. The men were deacons. Phoebe was a servant, same Greek word, different translation. Why? Because by the 4th century, when many of these translations were standardized, women were no longer allowed to hold church office. The translators couldn't reconcile a female deacon in the 1st century with a church law that forbade female deacons in the 4th, so they erased her authority. They translated it away. Case 2. Junia becomes Junias, Romans 16, verse 7. Paul writes, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles." Junia, a common female name in the Roman world, prominent among the apostles. Not just believers, apostles, leaders of the early church. For 1,000 years, every Greek manuscript, every commentary, every church father who mentioned this verse identified Junia as a woman. But starting in the medieval period, something changed. Scribes started writing Junias, a masculine name, except Junius doesn't appear anywhere else in ancient literature. No inscriptions, no papyri, no other references. It's a name that doesn't exist except in later Bible manuscripts. Why did scribes invent a male name to replace a female one? Because they couldn't accept that Paul had called a woman an apostle, so they changed her sex. And for centuries, English Bibles followed the altered text. Junia disappeared. Junias, a man who never existed, took her place. It wasn't until the 20th century that textual scholars proved the original text said Junia, a woman, an apostle, and the editors had erased her. Case 3. The Magdala Synagogue Stone. The stone carving discovered in 2009. It's a block of limestone with intricate temple imagery, menorahs, columns, architectural details of the Jerusalem temple. It was found in the ruins of a first-century synagogue in Magdala, a town on the Sea of Galilee. The stone was used in synagogue rituals, possibly as a Torah reading table, which means it was central to worship. The problem is that later rabbinic texts claim women were completely excluded from synagogue leadership and Torah reading in the first century. But the Magdala stone predates those texts, and there's no evidence that the Magdala synagogue had the kind of gender partition found in later synagogues. The stone suggests a different reality. A reality where women participated in synagogue life before the rabbis banned them. And the rabbis never mentioned the Magdala synagogue in their writings. They wrote extensively about other Galilean synagogues, but not that one. Why? Because it contradicted the narrative they were building, so they ignored it. And without archaeology, no one would have known it existed. Why did the erasure happen? 3 reasons. First, post-temple Judaism needed authority consolidation. After the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 Common Era, Jewish religious authority fragmented. The priesthood was gone. The sacrificial system was gone. Rabbinic scholars stepped into the vacuum and rewrote Jewish practice around Torah study and legal interpretation. But they faced competition from Christians, from other Jewish sects, from anyone who claimed religious authority. Excluding women from public religious life concentrated power. It eliminated half the population as potential rivals. It made the rabbinic class the sole gatekeepers of legitimate religious knowledge. The more restrictive the gender laws became, the more control the rabbis had. Second, early Christianity was competing with pagan religions where priestesses held power. The cults of Isis, Cybele, and Artemis all had female religious leaders, women who performed rituals, interpreted omens, and managed temple finances. If Christianity wanted to distinguish itself and appeal to Roman men in power, it had to distance itself from associations with female religious authority. Suppressing female leadership became a competitive strategy. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Church had fully adopted Roman patriarchal legal structures. Women were banned from ordination, banned from teaching men, banned from holding church office. And the Church Fathers justified it by claiming it had always been that way. They cited Paul's letters selectively. They ignored Phoebe and Junia. They rewrote history to make their present power structure look ancient and inevitable. Third, later editors literally rewrote Scripture to justify their current systems by projecting them backward. It's one thing to claim tradition. It's another to alter the texts that define tradition. But that's what happened. Manuscripts were copied by hand for over 1,000 years before the printing press. Every copy was an opportunity for change, and scribes made changes, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. When a scribe couldn't reconcile what the text said with what his church taught, he edited. A word here, a name there, a feminine ending changed to masculine. And the next scribe copied the edited version. Over centuries, those changes became the standard text. The original was lost, and no one knew it had been altered until modern textual criticism compared thousands of manuscripts and found the variations. Here's the smoking gun, comparison of the Dead Sea Scrolls with later Talmudic texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls date from the 3rd century before Common Era to the 1st century Common Era. They preserve Jewish texts before the Rabbinic period, and when you compare them to the Mishnah and Talmud, written 200 to 500 Common Era, you see it. The progressive restriction of women's freedoms, practices that were uncommon in the scrolls, become law in the Talmud. Restrictions that didn't exist in early texts become mandatory in later ones. The system was tightening, not loosening, not staying the same, getting worse. And the rabbis presented their innovations as ancient law, as if Moses himself had commanded them. But the scrolls prove otherwise. The archaeological evidence that couldn't be erased tells the rest. Ossuaries of women called teacher, leader, benefactor, inscriptions that use the same honorific titles given to male community leaders, house church ownership records showing women's names as property holders, burial monuments honoring women as synagogue patrons. These survive because the Romans didn't care enough to censor them, because later religious authorities couldn't destroy stone and bone the way they could edit manuscripts, and because no one thought to look for them until modern archaeology started asking different questions. If you want the history that traditional sources buried, if you want the investigations that religious authorities didn't want conducted, then stay with this. Because what we've uncovered here is just the beginning, the women written out of Scripture, the leaders erased from church history, the voices silenced by translation. They existed, and the evidence is still here. You just have to know where to dig. The legacy didn't end with the ancient world. The legal structure built in 1st century Palestine created frameworks that lasted centuries. Roman law and Jewish law merged in strange ways as Christianity spread through the empire. Concepts like coverture, the legal doctrine that a married woman's identity was subsumed into her husband's, came directly from Roman patria potestas, the idea that a father or husband owned a woman's legal personhood. That doctrine persisted in English common law until the 19th century. American women couldn't own property independently until the Married Women's Property Acts of the mid-1800s, couldn't vote until 1920, couldn't get credit cards without a husband's permission until 1974. The assumption that women's legal identity was derivative, that they needed male permission to participate fully in society, traces directly back to the Roman and Jewish legal codes that governed 1st century Judea. Religious language reinforced it: submission, obedience, covering. These weren't just ancient practices. They became theological concepts. Entire denominations built doctrines around them. The idea that a woman's primary place is the home, that her authority is domestic and her husband's is public, that she should be silent in church and submissive in marriage. All of this comes from Paul's letters as interpreted by church fathers who had their own reasons to restrict female power. And those interpretations became canon. They became doctrine. They became the Word of God, except they weren't. They were the words of men who wanted control and used theology to get it. Some things changed. Women gained legal personhood in most Western nations. The right to own property, the right to divorce, the right to vote, the right to work outside the home without a husband's permission. Those rights are recent. A woman born in 1900 in the United States could not vote. A woman born in 1950 in some U.S. states could not serve on a jury. A woman born in 1970 could not get a credit card alone. These aren't ancient history. These are lifetimes. But other things didn't change. The right to control your own body is still contested. Abortion, contraception, medical autonomy. The arguments used against them echo rabbinic debates from 2,000 years ago. Who owns a woman's womb? Who decides if she bears children? In first-century Jewish law, the answer was clear: her husband. If he wanted children and she refused, he could divorce her. If she wanted children and he refused, she had no recourse. Her body was his property under the Ketubah contract. Today the language is different, but the underlying question is the same. Does a woman have the right to make decisions about her own reproduction, or does the state, the church, the husband have the final say? That debate is ancient. It's still live. In some parts of the world today, women still cannot leave home without male permission. Saudi Arabia only granted women the right to drive in 2017. Afghanistan under Taliban rule requires women to have male guardians for travel and restricts their access to education and employment. These are legal systems, not fringe extremism. Governments enforce them. Religious authorities justify them. And the justification is the same one used 2,000 years ago. It's for women's protection, it's cultural tradition, it's divine law. The archaeological reminder is brutal. Those skeletons from Sepphoris with vitamin D deficiency, those ossuaries of teenagers who died in childbirth, those legal contracts where women are listed as property transferred between men. These are not metaphors. These are bodies. These are documents. These are the physical remains of lives lived under systems that treated women as subhuman. And for 2,000 years, those systems were defended as righteous, as natural, as the will of God. The power of historical erasure is this. For 2,000 years, the system was called divine design. It was called natural order. It was called protection. And some women believed it. Because when you're born into a cage and everyone around you calls it a house, you don't know you're trapped. The most effective prison is the one where the prisoner doesn't know they're imprisoned. The women of first-century Judea lived entire lives inside 300-square-foot spaces. They were told it was for their safety, told it was righteous, told it was God's plan. Some resisted, some found cracks in the system, but most didn't. Because resistance requires knowing there's something to resist. And the system was designed to make sure they never knew. What invisible walls exist in your world that you've been taught to call normal? What restrictions have you accepted as inevitable that are actually just inherited? Because the difference between those women and us isn't as much time as we'd like to think. It's visibility. They couldn't see their cage because everyone told them it was the natural shape of the world. What cage can't we see yet? What system are we defending today that future generations will dig up and recognize as brutal? What are we calling protection that's actually control? What are we calling tradition that's actually trauma passed down? The doorway of a first-century Galilean house was narrow, low. You had to duck to pass through it. The threshold was limestone, worn smooth by decades of feet crossing in and out. Thousands of women stood at that threshold and hesitated, looked out at the street, at the world they were forbidden to enter freely. Some of them crossed it anyway, paid the price, lost everything. Others stayed inside, kept their heads covered, kept their voices low, survived. But survival isn't the same as living. And the question we're left with is this. How many doorways are we standing at right now, told we can't cross, told it's for our own good, told it's just the way things are? And how many of us believe it?